Thank you very much for tuning in today. The subject of this webinar is on assessment in the new Citizenship Education 9. So we're looking today, we spent the last couple of webinars looking at what the course involved, how it was designed, specific components of service learning, as well as looking at some of the resources that are going to be available for you. So today we're just going to sort of look at some ideas for assessment that some of the pilot teachers used, and the kinds of things that you might look for given the new kinds of outcomes and the new sort of style of inquiry-based learning that we're doing. So that's the object of the day. So thank you very, very much for tuning in. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Wendy Driscoll, and I am the Social Studies Project Lead at the Department of Education. I am on a secondment here. I'm a teacher from the Halifax Regional Centre for Education, and I teach grades 7, 8, and 9 social studies. So I was borrowed here for 2 years to look after the creation of the course with a team of teachers and other stakeholders, and then have been working particularly over the last few months on getting the information out to teachers who are going to be teaching it in September. So the course is a brand new course right across the province in English and French immersion, and also in French first language. And we piloted the course across Nova Scotia with 18 teachers in 14 schools, and from that we were able to design a course that I think you're going to find really interesting, that students are going to find engaging, and it will replace Atlantic Canada in the global community starting right away. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll just give you a little overview of the kinds of things that we'll talk about today, and some of the things that I'll show you, and the questions that I can answer. So, so again, just a little intro to the course, and we're going to go right into the kinds of things that we're going to be assessing, looking at an inquiry-based approach, which is how the course was designed, and what are the assessment things that might come along with that. And we're going to look at some pilot teachers' ideas, and some of the things that they found useful. And we're going to talk a little bit about summative assessments and exams, because that seems to be a really popular question, and I understand why. A lot of people are asking, is there an exam in this course? So I do want to make sure that we have a chance to address that as well. So the first, I guess, discussion piece is this. And these are the essential graduation competencies. And you might be familiar with these in this configuration, or you might be familiar with them in their earlier form, which was as the essential, as the EAGLES, we called them. And these are the things that we would expect students to be able to achieve by the time they finish grade 12. So what are the things that we want them to aspire to over their whole school career in Nova Scotia? So when we look at these are the categories of competencies, the things, the aptitudes and the skills and the things that students should be able to know, show, and do. They build over their school career and by the time they get to graduation. So we are looking at students who are critical thinkers. We're looking for them to develop creativity and innovation, to consider personal and career development all through, communication, citizenship, and not just because this is a citizenship course, but citizenship as a global competency, and technological fluency. So those are the goals right across Nova Scotia, regardless of language, and these are the competencies that we hope that we're working towards in everything that we do. So these were the things that when the teacher team came here in the fall of 2016 to start developing the Citizenship Education course, these were the end goals. So we worked back from those. We said, if this is what we're aiming for, down the road in our students' careers, how do we get them ready for that here in grade 9? So with that in mind, all of the work that we did, all of the outcomes that we wrote were based on building up and developing and fostering the skills that would be necessary to meet those competencies. So when you look at this, just this little picture here, this is one that one of our teachers made up, just kind of looking at the intersection of a lot of skills. And you can see, you'd be familiar with a hierarchy of skills. But certainly when we're talking about the kinds of things that, regardless of subject, we want students to be able to do, we want them to be able to evaluate things. We want them to be able to plan. We want them to be able to collaborate. Because all of those skills, as they're honed, as they're developed over their school career, are what's going to get them to this in at the end of grade 12. So looking at that, kind of working back from that, when we were tasked with coming up with outcomes particular to the subject of social studies and citizenship education, we were looking at what is the content that goes with those skills that helps us arrive at those competencies. And so in Citizenship Education 9, we have developed the outcomes so that students will be able to use their content knowledge to demonstrate their skills. And so we're asking students to engage with the content, but to use that to show us that they have, or they're developing some of this, so they can get to that. So this makes assessment a really obviously important piece, and not just about the content, and not, do I know the, the names of all the political parties, or do I know, those kinds of content pieces, but what do I know about them that shows that I'm developing a new skill or getting better at a skill that I've been practicing. So what does that really mean in real life? So this is, I guess, what we really want to talk about today is what are the kinds of things that, how's it really going to look in my classroom, and what are the things I'm going to have to remember? This seems very nice and theoretical, but what are the things that are really going to matter to me day to day? So I'm going to use this particular outcome as an example. And so this is the second outcome in the series. And it is that learners will evaluate evolving concepts and attributes of citizenship as members of different kinds of communities. So we're looking at the concepts and attributes of citizenship as part of their content. We're looking at as members of different kinds of communities, so how they're connecting personally with that content, and then also the skill of evaluate. So what is it that we're evaluating? Well, we're looking at what it means to be a citizen now, and how am I engaged as a citizen, and what makes an engaged citizen or a good citizen or an active citizen. The indicators that go with this outcome, and we've been through these in a previous webinar, but the indicators that go with this outcome are the kinds of things that a student might be knowing, showing, and doing in your classroom that leads you to assess that they've got this. Okay? So are they able to compare rights and responsibilities as current citizens as as future citizens? Can they investigate how their worldview or their point of view, their background, their upbringing, their culture impacts their understanding of citizenship and how that might differ from other people? Are they able to evaluate their own strengths and skills and how they might use those to make contributions to their communities, or how that affects how they live in their communities, and how a citizen's role might change over time? And when we talk about students being citizens and being part of communities, we're talking about all different kinds of communities. So your class is a community, the school, the actual physical community in which they live, could be a cultural language community. So if I am 14 or 15, what are all the things that I'm doing? How are they important to the communities to which I belong? So these indicators are possible ones that you might have more, depending on what how you're tackling this in your class. But if they're doing some of these, and I can see that the skill of compare and the skill of investigate and so on is being achieved and being developed, then I might be able to say, yeah, they're able to evaluate, and they're able to do that in the context of the qualities of citizenship. So you set something up that will help you. The at a glance document, so I sent these documents, I had them in my last webinar, I think, and I sent them to some of you, but if you haven't seen this one, I can send it to you again. The At a Glance document is a downloadable document, and when you download it, it has a feature that if you hover over any of these skills, these verbs, these action words, then the box pops up and it tells you what that skill level looks like at the grade 9 level. So by the end of grade 9, we would expect the students to be able to evaluate in this way. One of the things that is probably a good idea is to also be able to look at what they have coming out of grade 8. And so you're also going to be able, in the curriculum guide, to click on the word, say, evaluate or investigate, whatever it happens to be, and it will take you to the skills continuum. And that is a document where we've got the skill, say, of evaluate, and what that looks like at every single grade level from primary to grade 12. And so I would look at this, I would say, if I was doing something at the beginning of the year, I would say, this is what I'm aspiring to with my grade 9s. I would like them to be able to review the steps and results from an investigation. I want them to reflect on what they found. I want them to communicate different parts of what they found. I want them to identify some problem-solving issues that came from what they were looking at, and I want them to make a decision and justify that. So that's the skill of evaluate. What I would do it with is the content that I was teaching at that particular time. So if I was going to have them evaluate evolving concepts and attributes of citizenship as members of different kinds of communities, I would be looking at the concepts of citizenship. I'd be looking at the concept of rights and responsibilities. I would be looking at what worldview is. What does that mean? Let's explore that for a little while. I'd be looking at how I engage now as a 14-year-old might be different than how my parents engage with their community, and how that might change as I get older, even after I can vote. And what's the relationship that people have with different kinds of communities. So those are all the concepts that go with this. And so being able to assess if they have this, do they understand the concept, and are they able to use this skill to show me that they understand these concepts. That's the link, I guess, between the concept and skill. So when we ask students to be able to use, we want them to be able to show us that they know how to do their skills by accessing the content, or we want you to be able to assess the student learning, assess the outcome in relation to those skills and concepts. That's what we mean. That's what we mean we're trying to put all that together. So Cheryl had a question, and her question was, if in the previous slide the student is not successful on that assessment, how do we know if it's because they can't evaluate or because they don't understand the content? Okay, so if we're looking at either this, I guess both of these, this one, where we're talking about the skill in particular, but if we look at this, how do we know? So if I'm going to I'm looking at my student and I'm saying, okay, I'm not really sure they're getting it. How do I know as their teacher that it's that they don't understand concepts and attributes of citizenship, or they don't know how to evaluate? So that's a really, really excellent question. And so my answer to that is that we would never do this just once. So you wouldn't have this be the only time that you were assessing this outcome, and with the skill of evaluate, for example, it wouldn't be the only time that evaluate would come up. So if I was having my students work on designing the ideal citizen, for example, and they were drawing a picture of all the qualities of an ideal citizen, I might be looking at that particular time when I'm coming around. I might be looking at some of the concepts that they're looking at. I might be assessing that. I might be looking at, are they being able to examine or reflect on more than one point of view? So I might be looking more at the skill, but I'm going to be doing that more than once. This particular outcome, there's only 11 outcomes, so you would never spend just a short period of time or just assess one outcome once. So the multiple opportunities to show that they can do that, the ability to pull apart what it is you're looking at that particular day, and then, of course, the fact that those same skills, all the skills that we're hoping that they have, those skills recur. throughout the curriculum, and not just in social studies, but they would also recur in other subjects. So evaluate at the grade 9 level, regardless of what it is they're evaluating, should be the same skill and the same goal by the end of grade 9. So I hope that answers that question. Okay. All right, so going back to my example, so if this is my outcome, evaluate evolving concepts and attributes of citizenship as members of different kinds of communities, and I want to look at evaluate being review steps and results, reflect on that, communicate different perspectives, identify potential new problems and issues, and justify decisions or findings. If those are the things that I'm looking at, all at the same time that I'm looking at rights and responsibilities, I'd be assessing their ability to evaluate. That's the skill. And I would use their concepts of citizenship to see if they got it. So again, bringing those two pieces together to report on the outcome. So back when I first started teaching in the early 1990s, we would really have only been assessing the content. And probably when certainly when I went to school, and probably a number of you went to school, it was very content heavy. So do you know all of this list of characteristics? Can you label this? Can you list them? Do you know the names of all the levels of government or whatever it happened to be? So now, those are the things that we're going to use, we're going to explore, we're going to investigate so that we can develop all of the skills that lead us to things like critical thinking, creativity and innovation, all those competencies that we're aiming towards as our end goal. So they might evaluate their own strengths and explain how they can contribute as citizens. So they're evaluating their strengths, and then they're linking that to what are the attributes of citizenship. So what are the things I can do to make a contribution? Or they might also look at what are the different kinds of communities that I belong to, and what does that say about the kinds of active citizenship I might look at in the future. So am I involved in different volunteer organizations? Is that something that will probably carry through? So kind of looking at making those predictions and so on, but all of that being part of the evaluation. We would assess their ability to evaluate using their content knowledges of things like rights, responsibilities, and roles of citizens. So they have to be able to identify those pieces. They have to be able to articulate those. They have to be able to use the language of the subject. So you're still evaluating that content piece, but you're doing it in the context of a skill that we're hoping they develop over the year. So James says, I'm thinking in reverse. I always assumed that skills were used to master content. So I agree. You're definitely going to have a number of skills before you can tackle certain kinds of content. And so when we're talking about these skills, these aren't skills that were just introduced to grade 9. So these are skills that have been developing over the life of the student. And what we do with them in grade 9 is the further development of those at an appropriate level. But yeah, there's a number of skills that we would expect them to have already practiced as they came through. But also, we want them to be able to take a look at content, take a look at something that they read or they view or they hear about, and be able to use skills to make an analysis of that, to make a decision about that. And those are the important skills that, regardless of what the content is, regardless of what they do down the road in their post-secondary life, that they'll be able to, they'll have had practice using those skills, they'll be able to use those well regardless of the content. But yeah, it's all about the development of those skills, James, and being able to pull out the things that you've already done, apply them to a new situation, and move that forward. So I wanted to talk a little bit about inquiry-based learning and project-based learning. So the design of the course is as an inquiry course. And I talked about this in an earlier webinar, especially when I went through kind of what the outcomes. And any of you who have been in some of the other webinars or had a chance to look at the curriculum outcomes, or who I've been really fortunate I've been able to get out and meet a few of you. One of the things that people are noticing right away is that the outcomes are not content heavy. So we don't see, for example, in one of the outcomes where we talk about the electoral, how government is elected or selected in Canada, we don't actually name the electoral process. We don't say it's first past the post, or we don't say that there's X amount of political parties, or things like that, because we want to be able to allow you to use what's current, to grow and change as things change in the world. So to do that, we've taken an inquiry-based approach with the curriculum. And what that means is that as the teacher and as the facilitator of the students in your classroom, you have the choice of what you want to explore in relation to that outcome. So it's designed to promote a number of different levels of inquiry. And people have a lot of different experiences with inquiry, and that's great. I know that pretty much everybody would have experience with guided inquiry, so that would be the kind of thing that the teacher is the one that comes up with the question and kind of leads the discussion and maybe brings in some resources to examine, so that we're coming to sort of a common understanding. That's a guided inquiry. I think we all do that. An open inquiry is sort of the other extreme, where you have students who have developed the necessary skills to do that by themselves, and they're able to come up with their question and know how to find out the answer and be able to articulate their choice in the end. And it takes a lot to get to that, and not everybody is going to get there at the same time, and not every student is going to get there at the same time. And the blended inquiry is kind of the middle piece, where the teacher is involved in that selection process, or guides the theme of that inquiry, but allows for a gradual release of responsibility to the student, so they can look at the sources and so on. Inquiry, sometimes when people see the word project or inquiry-based, they think big. It doesn't have to be big. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute of a teacher who used an inquiry activity, really simple, and how she assessed that. So don't always think that it has to be like a gigantic project in order for it to be project-based learning. It can be something, a short inquiry into a question in class with a follow-up, or with an independent exploration, a follow-up. But yeah, this is about the gradual release of responsibility. We know, and we've seen this before, and I'll show you the triangle later because we understand that graphic, but when students are engaged in inquiry, we as teachers can gather evidence in a number of ways. Conversations, observations, and products, so those are the three sort of main categories. We're all familiar with products, and certainly again, when I started teaching, it was only about products. I don't think I ever gave a student, I don't think I ever assessed. I might have made a note of an observation, but it wasn't something that I assessed, because that was not the trend at the time. The reason that this is so important now is because there's multiple ways for students to show us what they know. And so being able to find out more from a student by having a conversation with them, or being able to just stand back and observe what they're doing without them having to present something formally, are real gifts in the classroom. And so I'm encouraging you to, if you haven't had a lot of chances to engage with conversation and observation in your practice, to maybe choose one or two things in the fall that you might want to add observation as part of the assessment package that you're doing for a particular outcome. How do we track? Douglas asked, how do we track conversation and observation? So let me give you an example of one of the things the pilot teacher did, and then maybe I'll talk about a couple of different ideas that have come up over the pilot year and through our consultation with others. So this is an example from one of the pilot teachers, and it's on that outcome that I was using in my example earlier. So what she did was she gave each group of students in her grade 9 class a set of materials to build a tower. So I'm sure we've all done similar kinds of little tower competitions, group work, working together, collaboration kinds of things. And so she gave every group the same material, and then she gave each group a card that described something about their group. So in the first group, she picked a student to be the leader. And she said, so-and-so is the leader, you do what they say, period. They're in charge of building the tower, you only do what they say. And then another group, she said, okay, you have to choose a leader. You have to, by any means you want, but once you've chosen the leader, you have to do what they say. And then third group, she said, you need to work together. Everybody has to have a part in the building of the tower. Nobody gets left out, and everybody has to agree with every step of the tower building. So then she let them build their towers, and then afterwards they, measured them and did all those things for the competition. But as they were doing that, and starting to have their discussion, they realized that the experience in other groups was different from the experience in their own group. And when they started talking as a class about how decisions were made, that led into the conversation about the challenges of making decisions as a group, what happens when people agree or don't agree on something in a group, and then what kind of leadership is effective in different kinds of group situations. So she was using it as a lead up to that relationship to communities piece. And also, she would have been able to then, in another class, refer back to this activity when she was talking about different kinds of political structures, right? She would have said, well, remember when you were in that group. So she would have had a longer term connection, I guess, built in there. But the day that she did this, she was really looking at, are they able to engage in some type of evaluation of what the attributes of citizenship are and how it is that people get along in community. So she has her discussions here, her discussion questions, and these were just for each group and then I think the whole class. And then what she did was she engaged them in just a quick write that they had to hand in on their way out. What are the benefits and challenges of working with other people in a group or community? And so there's a little bit of the evaluation piece in there. So she's looking at this skill of evaluate, same thing that we had before, where they had to, in order to do this quick write, or in order to engage in this group discussion, they would have had to have been able to review steps and results from what they did. Okay, how did it work in our group versus someone else's group? They would have had to do a little bit of reflection. How would it have been different? What problems did it present? For example, in the group where there was no leader, was there a step that everybody couldn't get over because you couldn't all agree? Identifying new problems or ways to solve them, and then justifying your decision in the end. So we were talking, and one of the things that we were sort of looking at was the quick write that she did was a definite plus because it was a product that everybody had to do, and she was able to engage with all of the students, at least on paper. The group discussion, though, she would have been able to also evaluate through the class discussion to assess whether they were picking up on those skills and those concepts. So she could use a checklist, for example. So during the group discussion, she might have been looking for evidence of reflection, for example, that day. Or she might have been having, in the class discussion, she might have been looking for evidence of them using some of the vocabulary that they had learned about rights and responsibilities of citizenship, in a previous class. She could have had a rubric where she had a little piece about the discussion and a little piece about the quick write. So in answer to, I guess, James's question, Douglas's question, how do we track conversations and observations? You can track conversations and observations the same way as you would have tracked a written piece. So, but instead of students submitting it to you on paper, they're sitting down next to you and having that conversation. But you can still be looking for those same criteria, those same pieces of stages of evaluation, those same pieces of the context that the activity was set in. And then you can report on that the same way you would have reported on a written piece. Cheryl asks, can you give a specific example of how evidence is tracked, value assigned, is it by skills or content, and how it is tracked in gradebook? So gradebook hasn't changed yet, although there is a new version of PowerSchool Pro, that will be coming out over the next few years. I think there's a few people in the province who are giving it a try, or sort of keen technology reporters. And so there might be an opportunity with that to be able to pull those apart, to be able to look at skills and content together side by side. But right now, you're just going to report on the outcomes the way that they are. So I would be looking at that whole outcome that students will be able to, or learners will be able to evaluate the attributes and so on of citizenship. So we're still going to report on that the same way in PowerSchool, and it depends on your jurisdiction. So if you're doing, some folks do it on a 4-3-2-1 scale, so are they meeting the outcome, are they exceeding it, or so on. And then some folks are doing it in their jurisdictions in the province with a number grade or percentage grade, but you're still going to be doing the same way, so you're still going to track it the same way in gradebook. You can definitely, what I'm trying to say, I guess, with the observations and the conversations is that that is a very legitimate way to evaluate what is happening in your classroom. It's a very legitimate way to assess your students. And just because you don't have anything on paper doesn't mean that you cannot back up that evidence. So if you're using a checklist, or you're using a rubric, or even if you're writing anecdotal notes, as long as you know what it is that you're looking for that day and you're able to document that, then that is excellent evidence of student learning, and you can track that in gradebook, even with the whatever parameters you have currently in your school. So if a teacher was tracking something like this teacher was doing in the class discussion, they said she might be looking for particular evidence of steps in the evaluation that day, and she might do it in a checklist. She might have a rubric where she's adding to it every time she has an opportunity, and then putting that information into PowerSchool. So I hope that answers that question. Let's move on to assessment ideas, because this is where the pilot teachers were particularly valuable in really trying all kinds of stuff this year and letting each other know what was working and what wasn't working. So this is just, I met with them last week, and we talked about all the things they had tried this year and in what sort of themes, like what units did they do, different kinds of assessments. And they did everything from projects to interviews, art. There were the service learning projects. They did class discussions. There was exams, portfolios, online portfolios, just really anything, and probably exactly the kind of thing that you're doing now. So all the things that you would have done in other courses or in the old grade 9 course, there's this plus more. So there's lots and lots of ways that you can assess what students are learning in your classroom. And I encourage you to sort of think outside of the traditional box or test box. Okay, so we mentioned talking about venturing out and trying some conversations and observations as part of the assessment, along with the products that always also give you some data. And so before we get into assessment and exams, I guess summative assessment and exams, Therese asked, are administrators aware of the inquiry nature of this class and how the outcomes will be assessed? I anticipate some parent questions, on observational assessment as a summative assessment. So that's a really good point. I think a lot of folks can, quickly see the value of observation as a formative piece, but as a summative piece, sometimes it's really hard to add teeth to that as a teacher and to kind of prove that it is every bit as valuable as something that the students wrote down. So I guess the two parts to your question, are administrators aware of the nature of this? They are. So we send the information out to administrators through the Regional Centers for Education. So their directors and their program coordinators know how the course goes, and they've been involved in learning about this course. But also, if you look at the changes, and some of you probably aren't super familiar if you're junior high and high school teachers, but the changes that have already occurred in grade primary to 6. So those are integrated outcomes you could do across different subjects. And so that whole idea of inquiry-based learning has been moving up from the elementary and into the junior high already anyway. So I think there's an awareness there. Certainly, I think that if you're venturing into using observation and conversation more formally in your reporting, just to make sure that you have a way of tracking that. So whether you do it, like I said, on paper and then put it into your grade book, whether you keep track, whatever your favorite way. I don't know if you have certain devices that you like to use, but anything that you would do for a written piece or an oral presentation that you're sitting and watching, you can still do that for all of those observation and conversation. One of the things that I did a few years ago was on the final exam, this was in Atlantic Canada Global Community, I was at a school where we did give a final exam, and I gave the students a choice of doing a written or an interview. And for the interview, I gave the same basic questions that were going to be on the written, but they were able to discuss them with me. And what I did in that one, because it was kind of a higher stakes summative assessment, I did a voice recording of it, so that if a parent wanted to come in, the same way as a parent is entitled to look at the student's exam after they get it back, they could come in and they could listen to the interview, and we could talk through the same kind of points that I would have done with the student. Of course, I gave them a rubric the same way as they would have had for a written exam, and the rubric was looking for the same kinds of things. So do they understand in that case it was the concept of, I think it was the interdependence one was the one that was really the key feature at that time. And so do they understand the concepts of that? Are they able to look at something from different points of view? Have they shown me those sorts of skills and so on? So that for a high stakes kind of assessment, you may want to go that far, but certainly as long as you're keeping track, then those are valid, valuable, and legitimate ways of assessing your students. So that kind of brings me actually, Trez, into this last piece, and this has been a real hot topic of discussion right across the board. So summative assessment, or should we have an exam? And if we are going to have an exam in this course, what does that exam look like? So my instinct when we were first designing the course was that it didn't lend itself super well to a traditional written 2-hour sit in the gymnasium kind of exam. But that's not to say that you can't have a written exam for this course. It's just that you're going to have to build up the skills that the students are going to need to be able to show you that they are developing that by writing stuff down. So, I guess just a word of caution for if you're going to have a written exam at the end of the course, to make sure that during the school year they have opportunities to express themselves in writing to show you that they are able to or predict, for example, all those kinds of things. They'll predict, for example, all those kinds of things in their writing. There were a couple of schools that had written exams at the midterm and a different kind of exam at the end of the year. It really just depended on what kind of configuration. A lot of the 9 to 12 schools, the students are writing some type of summative assessment during the exam week, but they don't all necessarily have to be written. So some other ideas that have come up through the year, and I'll give you an example from one of the groups in a second. Interviews, as I mentioned, simulations, so maybe you do a model parliament and you assess everybody on the role that they played in the model parliament, bringing together all of their knowledge of governance, for example. You could use the service learning project, which I talked about in my last webinar, so you could use the actual service learning project or the reflection that goes with it as a cumulative piece at the end of the semester or the end of the year. Written assignments, so they could certainly do a more process exam, but one that was also written, or visuals, and videos and things like that. There is a group, I'll just maybe skip ahead to that, come back, and this is their question. They decided that one of the questions that came up in their classes a lot was, what does it mean to be an engaged citizen? And so what they decided to do, there's a group of them at that school, 2 English teachers and 1 French immersion teacher, and they decided that they were going to, they were going to give an exam. It was going to be a process exam, and they were going to do it, well, they're doing it this week, so they were doing it the week leading up to the actual exam schedule. And they all agreed on this as the question. And they asked their students to choose an option to help them answer this question, what does it mean to be an engaged citizen? So the options in this instance were a mural, so an art piece. They had a video piece, which was a how-to video for citizenship teachers, so they were kind of thinking of you, I guess. There was a physical, like a lap book, so where they could physically lay out some of the pieces that they learned. And the other option was to engage in a discussion group that was kind of like in a fishbowl situation. And everybody had to prepare. So you had to prepare for the discussion by bringing together what you had learned this year about engaged citizenship. So what does that mean financially? What does that mean in terms of democracy? What does that mean in terms of my skills or my relationship to my community? So you bring all those ideas and you either are making notes for the discussion, you're putting it into a piece of art or video, or you're making something visual that you can share with your teacher. And they really found that that was one way that they could kind of all agree as a group that everybody who had taken citizenship that year in that school was going to get a similar experience. So when I said here, what about common assessments? I know that that is, in some schools, it's a requirement that every section of the same course has the same exam or the same final assessment. So if you're in a situation where that is the case, or you would like it to be the case, then what I encourage you to do is I encourage you to look at something that's quite broad. So look at something that is a big idea, a big question. I know, what does it mean to be an engaged citizen is a nice big question that regardless of whether you focused on the environment in this class and human rights in this class and something else in the other class, that you could still sink your teeth into that question. Or the other thing you can do is if you wanted to look at something common across a number of classes in the same school, you could all agree to do the same kind of exam. So you could say, okay, well, this year in grade 9, everybody's going to do a different simulation. So we might do a model parliament, and in your class you might do mock trial, or you might have an election or something like that, where we're all going to do simulation. So that's another way to kind of make the experience similar across classes. Just maybe, regardless of what you do, whether you're doing it individually or whether you're doing it with colleagues in the same school, just consider this idea of an overarching question and honor their experience. So asking them questions where they can use the experience that they gained that year in the course, that they gained through like their service learning project or other things that they were involved in, that they can use that experience to show you how they've developed as a citizen, or how they've developed the skills that they're going to need going forward. And so that would be my little piece of advice, just based on all the things that have happened in the pilot this year. Or you could come up with something new and you can share it with everybody next year, and we could all benefit from that. So yeah, whatever, if you're going to have a summative, just use your imagination, and I encourage you to think differently about that. I put a few. These are just from these are from the pilot teachers. They assessed a lot of different things in different ways, and I just sort of put a few of them up here just to give you an idea of the whole variety of things that are out there. The book that the Engaged Citizenship book that I talked about last week, it does have a teacher part that goes with it, and we're sending you a book on inquiry-based learning. And both of those have some reproducibles that you might want to build off of. You make them your own. If you're interested, lots of different checklists and rubrics and things like that for tracking purposes. Or you can make your own like this teacher did here. And finally, I just put my contact information up there. If you have any more questions, if you're not on my email list, please go ahead and sign up. And don't forget to register for your self-directed professional learning day. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say is the second last thing, there's a lot of new stuff, right, in this course, and there's a lot of new, it's a whole new set of outcomes. It's not like we just tweaked what was there. What's there was gone, so we got something totally new. There's new books. There's a lot of e-learning going on. We're asking you to take special consideration and assess skills in the context of the content that they're learning. So it's a lot, right? And so just change a little bit at a time. Don't feel like you need to September the 1st, just do everything differently. So you can certainly start to ease yourself into the things that you want to try. Try one assessment where you're using observation. People in your building are already doing this. Go see the band teacher. Go see the phys ed teacher. They're using observation all the time. So there's lots of people that are already, well versed in different styles of assessment. So don't be afraid to reach out to some of those people, and don't be afraid to check with each other and see what other people are doing. But take it a little bit at a time, right? So start with something like an exploration of who am I as a citizen, or how the government works in Canada, and do some of it in a guided way, do some of it where they have to pass something in that you assess in a more traditional way, but then start to expand how that looks in your classroom, and gradually release that responsibility to them. One of the pilot teachers, she told me that when she was trying to get them involved in their service learning project, the best thing she did was get out of their way. And so I'm asking you not to get completely out of their way, but to certainly gradually give them some of that responsibility, because that's really what citizenship education is all about. And finally, I would say, too, that if this is the last webinar in this series, and thank you very much for hanging out with me on all these different days and tuning in after the fact as well. The webinars will be kept, eventually they'll be in the virtual classroom or in-school online Moodle, but they're available for you and your colleagues going forward to review, or if someone gets assigned the course. And if you have other ideas for webinars that you'd like to share with me, I'd be happy to either try them myself, or if it's not something that's within my area of expertise, that I could probably find somebody, engage somebody to do that for you. So if you have other ideas for webinars, or you'd like to see something next year where on a different topic or an update or things like that, just let me know, because I think it's a really neat way to engage with people. Some of the same people have been tuning in every time, and so I feel like I have a nice relationship with a lot of people, and it really makes it easier when we're going out and we're doing professional learning. I'll be in my classroom next year, and so I'll still be around. My contact information is there, and I'm super happy to help with anything that people need going forward. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your year, and good luck in September. Thank you.